We're continuing our series in the book of James this week. We started it last week. You can go find it on YouTube and catch up with us. We've called this series Faith Works. We said there's a couple of different ways that you can look at that tagline as kind of a play on words. What we looked at last week was that faith works as advertised. Faith does what it's supposed to do. Faith works. When we talked about going through trials with joy, coming through them with contentment and satisfaction, and that God gave us specific things that we can have faith in, and then it works. This week, as promised, we're going to look at the other side of that phrase, faith works, and we're going to talk about faith produces action. Faith goes to work. James hits this head on here in the last half of chapter 1. But before we really dig in, we kind of need to address this underlying tension, kind of this elephant in the room when it comes to the book of James. And that is, how is James cohesive with the rest of the Bible? Like how does James and the rest of the New Testament jive together? By that I mean, when we read the New Testament and we talk about the gospel, the good news, we believe that happens through faith. We can't earn our way to heaven. We can't do enough good things. We can't have enough good works in order to save ourselves, right? Ephesians 2:8-9 says, "For you are saved by grace through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is God's gift, not from works." There's that idea, so that no one can boast. But James talks a lot about works. In fact, in James chapter 2, verse 26, which we'll look at in a future time together, he says, "For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead." So how do these two ideas tie together? Well, I think James talks about this and addresses it head on in this last half of chapter 1 and in future chapters. And in doing so, he kind of takes us on a journey. That's what I've called it here. There's 4 steps in our journey together as we finish up chapter 1. The first step is this: slow down. Slow down. Let's pick it up where we left off last week, chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. "My dear brothers and sisters, understand this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness." I like the way the Message paraphrase puts it: lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let anger straggle along in the rear. This is great wisdom and counsel when it comes to dealing with the people around us. And there's kind of 2 categories that we see here, right? The one category, James is saying we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. The other category is, if we're just going to use the opposites, is slow to listen, but quick to speak and quick to anger. Do you know people like that? Right? Like you probably can think of someone immediately pops into mind when you think of these 2 categories. We can all think of someone that's slow to listen, but quick to speak and quick to anger. When that happens, you might have heard this phrase before, we're not listening to understand, we're listening to just respond. Maybe you've been in an argument like that, or a conversation where you're talking and things are maybe a little bit heated, or there's passionate disagreements, and you're talking, but you can see the other person and their wheels are turning. They're not really listening to what you're saying. They're not engaging. They're just waiting for you to be done so that they can respond and make their point. But truth be told, when then they're talking, oftentimes that's us too, right? Like we're not really listening to them, just our wheels are turning that we can formulate the best response. And so we can all think of somebody that goes in that category, but let's turn that perspective inward now for a moment and do a little bit of self-reflection of those 2 categories, the quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, or slow to listen, but quick to speak, quick to anger. Which category would you put yourself in? Which one of those 2 sides do you think you fall in? Well, honestly, most of us would put us in that first category. Like we all kind of think that we're rational, logical people that understand arguments and that we're good listeners and we take our time. Most of us would probably put ourselves in that category, right? But let me ask one more question. Which category would others put you in? Like, do you think you came to somebody else's mind when they're thinking about that second category? Maybe so. Why don't we see ourselves in that way? Why do we tend to put ourselves in the first category when maybe more often than not, we're really in the second category? You know, I think our pride gets in the way. We begin to tell ourselves stories about the other person's motives or what they're really saying or what's behind their conversation. And we judge ourselves by our best intentions, but we assign the worst possible motives to the person that's on the other side of the table. Now, why would James open up this section by talking about this? Well, he said it in verse 20. He says, anger doesn't accomplish God's desire for a righteous life for you. Now, as you're listening to this, you might think, well, okay, yeah, be slow to anger. Joel, I don't really get angry, at least not outwardly. You know, I'm pretty self-controlled. I don't lose my temper. I don't raise my voice a lot. Now, maybe some of you, you know that is the case for you. But for others, you're thinking, I don't really feel like I get angry. Well, don't make the mistake here of thinking that anger can just be talking about things that are happening on the outside. Anger can manifest on the inside too. Often it shows up in the way of bitterness or how we feel towards someone, that we're angry towards someone. Now, somebody else might not know that, right? That doesn't come out, but in our hearts there is anger. Now, for those of you that are saying, oh no, I do get angry. I acknowledge I get angry, but I only get angry about righteous things. You know, I have a righteous anger. Like Joel, right? Don't you remember when Jesus Christ went into the temple and he turned the tables over, right? So we can be angry. And to that I would just say, listen, if you can go and act with as pure of motives as Jesus Christ did in your anger, then knock yourself out. But for the rest of us that maybe don't have as pure of motives, let's keep reading and see what else James tells us on this journey. Step number two is to receive the word. Step one is just slow down. Step number two, receive the word. Verse 21. Therefore, ridding yourselves of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, humbly receive the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. There's a word in this verse that I think everything else in this passage hinges on. And it's the word humbly. James hits us square between the eyes with this word humbly. I really spent time this week contemplating this word. What does it mean? How does it change this passage? Well, in the definition that I read this week, as far as how it's used specifically here in James 1:21, I found this: meekness, but not in a man's outward behavior only, nor in his relations to his fellow man or his mere natural disposition. Rather, it is an inwrought grace of the soul, and the expressions of it are primarily toward God. It is that attitude of spirit that we accept God's dealing with us as good and do not dispute or resist. You know, verses 19 and 20, what we read a moment ago about being quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, obviously that's just good wisdom when we're interacting with other people. The book of Proverbs talks a lot about some of those same ideas. So I'm not discounting that at all. But what if that concept in verses 19 and 20, what if that concept also has to do with what we're about to read? With how we're about to interact with what God is telling us through the book of James? What if being quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to anger has to do with how do we deal with God's commands? James is about ready to tell us some pretty harsh things, some pretty blunt or direct things. And James is prefacing what he's about to tell us with this idea of just put your guard down and listen. Be quick to listen to the word, to humbly receive the implanted word, James says. Be quick to listen to God's commands and be slow to speak, Slow to anger because often when we're confronted with direct truths, we put our defenses up, right? Like we're going to try to justify ourselves or somehow find a way around it as if it's not applying to us. And James is saying, listen, just slow down, receive the word, and listen to it for a moment. Because here's what he says that's pretty direct. It's step number 3 on our journey. Do the word. Verse 22. But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Because if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like someone looking at his own face in a mirror. For he looks at himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of person he was. But the one who looks intently into the perfect law of freedom and perseveres in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer who works, this person will be blessed in what he does. Verse 22, be doers of the word and not hearers only, is really the theme verse of the entire book of James. And James is laying out this idea that it's not just enough to hear the word, we're to act on it. We're to do it. To say it another way, if you aren't doing the word, that is, if we're not doing what God's commanded us to do, you haven't really obeyed the word. And if you haven't obeyed the word, you haven't really heard the word. And if you haven't heard the word, then you really haven't accepted the word. James is as direct as can be here. If you say you heard it, but you're not doing it, you're deceiving yourself. Now, this sounds very familiar to some same things that Jesus Christ said. Right? Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. You know, we've convinced ourselves, we've deceived ourselves in our pride that we're doing okay. That we can somehow hear the word, but not do the word. And that's like, you know, I've used a lot of ridiculous illustrations in my time here, right? Like last week I talked about a magic trick. If you were at the in-person gathering last week, I actually did a magic trick on the stage to illustrate the point. I've talked about a sausage biscuit. Someone reminded me of that last week. I talked about being a sausage biscuit kind of person, not an empty grapevine kind of person. We've talked about playing chess blindfolded. Of course, you know my love for Wegmans. I'll use that in an illustration when I can. James does the same thing here. He kind of uses a ridiculous illustration because he says someone that hears the word but doesn't then go out and do the word is like someone that looks into a mirror, studies it intently. That's the idea, that they're looking intently at themselves in the mirror, but then they walk away, and like if you then say you handed them a family photo, they wouldn't know which one they were. Sounds ridiculous on its face, right? Well, that's James' point. Too often we hear what the word says, but we think it applies to those sitting around us, or somehow it doesn't apply to me, or God doesn't mean me when he says that, or we leave and we're not changed by what we heard. We just forget about it. We've just listened. All the sermons in the world, all of the Bible study times in the world, all of the theological learning and training in the world, if it doesn't result in action, if it doesn't result in a changed life, then it's doing no good. And more than that, it means we really haven't heard the word. I mean, we've heard it, but we haven't heard it. We haven't internalized it. We really haven't accepted it. We really haven't believed it. That seems harsh, doesn't it? James is being direct here. In fact, maybe as I've even talked so far, you're feeling a little defensive. You're feeling the hairs on the back of your neck stand up just a little bit, and you don't like to be challenged in this way. But is it possible that you have deceived yourself, that I have deceived myself? And James started this by saying, remember, slow down. Just be quick to listen to what it is that I want to talk about. Be slow to speak, slow to anger, but humbly receive these things. I mean, really what James is talking about makes sense. If you think about it, right? I mean, if you believe it, you'll do it. If you don't do it, do you really believe it? Jesus said again in John chapter 14, verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commands. Now I want to stop for just a moment and talk again about that tension. Let's address that we talked about in the beginning of our time together, the balance between faith and works, and how do they coexist. Let me make a couple things abundantly clear. First, we work, we do acts of service, we keep God's commands, not so that God will love us, not so that God will love us more, but because God has already loved us. I mean, think about what Jesus just said in that verse. If you love me, you will keep my commands. Well, who loved who first? Did we love Jesus first? No. Jesus and God, they loved us first, even while we were God's enemies, even before we were capable of doing any acts of service. Jesus died on the cross for us. And so it's because of his love for us and then our returned love for him that we are to keep Jesus' commands. John gives us a litmus test in chapter 3, verse 14 that again illustrates this idea. 1 John 3:14, we know that we have passed from death to life because we love our brothers and sisters. The one who does not love remains in death. It's this litmus test of how do you know if you have genuine faith? Well, it's going to produce works. We don't do works in order to earn our faith in some way. Do you understand that difference? Do you see the distinction there? If our faith isn't producing works, then we need to take a hard look at our faith. Now, let me talk for a moment to the person who's maybe been thinking about making a decision about Jesus, or maybe you're a young person and you're questioning whether this faith thing is all worth it, and you're trying to wrestle with some things on your own, and you look around, and one of the big hang-ups for you is this idea, right? Like that the people around you, like they say one thing, they say they have faith, but then they do something else, or you don't really see it living out in their life. They don't seem to be changed by it. Just know this, that James is letting us know this isn't the way that it's supposed to be. Genuine faith produces genuine works. That brings us to the last step in this journey that James is taking us on, and just called it, for example, verses 26 and 27. If anyone thinks he is religious without controlling his tongue, his religion is useless and he deceives himself. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. You might have been reading up to this part and thought, like, okay, what are the works then that we're supposed to be doing? What should my faith in God be producing? And so James closes out this section with an example on the tongue, our conversation. We're not going to unpack this a lot here. James actually gets more in depth on just our speech and controlling the tongue. That's coming up in chapter 3. And really most of the rest of the book of James is about these examples that we should be following. And he continues to be pretty direct in the things that he's saying. So that's coming up in future weeks. But James closes out here with just one example that all of us can relate to. And he's tying it back really to how he opened this section, right? With the quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. He's saying, listen, if your faith hasn't changed the way you speak, if your faith hasn't changed the way you have conversations that would make you distinct or unstained from the world, is how he's phrasing it. If you're not different from the world in how you disagree with someone, how you interact with them on social media or face-to-face in person, or how you talk to someone directly, or maybe how you interact with people in a social setting, maybe strangers that you don't know. If your faith hasn't changed the way that you talk about people when they're not around, if your faith hasn't changed the way that you show honor to people that God has put as authority figures in your life, or even if your faith hasn't changed the way you interact with God when He's giving you these commands and you get angry with God for giving us these instructions, then your faith is, the word James uses here, useless. This passage should cause us to pause. Right? I mean, James has said it. John has said it. Jesus has said it. Jesus said it again in Luke chapter 6, verse 46. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and you don't do the things that I say?" In fact, then James gives us the two main things that are important to Jesus. Take care of those in need and live a distinct life from the world. If we're not doing those things, then we have to really question whether our faith is genuine. It's direct. I know that. It's harsh to think about that. But I think that's why James started. Listen, just listen. Be slow to speak for a minute. Be slow to anger. And just humbly receive these words from God. Now, you're listening to this, you're saying, okay, maybe I have been deceiving myself about a particular area in my life. What can I do? I think there's three steps that you can take going forward. The first, James gave it to us, is to look into the mirror, to stare intently at yourself and to analyze, okay, where is it that maybe I need to do a little bit better, where maybe I've been deceiving myself about a particular command, where I've tried to make it that doesn't apply to me, or so that's someone else's job to worry about, to absorb the Scripture, to know what the Bible says, and to do it without putting my defenses up, which is slowing down. So step one is look in the mirror. Step two is ask God, and maybe some trusted other people in your life, where you might be deceived. That's the problem with deceiving ourselves, right? Is that we don't know we're deceiving ourselves. I mean, I think there's times where deep down we know, like we just know that we're not really believing what God has told us. But Scripture seems to indicate there are other times where we think we are doing the right thing and we have deceived ourselves. And so ask God to show you where that might be and trust God to reveal it, and then slow down enough to listen to what He tells you. And the third thing then you can do is to take a step. To take a step. If you're wondering about what steps to take, what things can I be doing, we've covered several sermon series in the last couple of years on mission. The One Another's, Lord and the Smartest Person, Grace Bomb would be a tremendous one for this week. Maybe you could go back and review those and say, okay, what is it that God commands us to do in Scripture that I'm not doing? And I want to take some of those steps. Don't get psyched out about where you're supposed to be, right? Like, we're here, we know we should be here, and sometimes the distance is so wide we get discouraged before even going. So just taking a small step at a time and remembering that it's a process. It's not perfection. We talked about that last week in the beginning of James 1, where God is working on us and molding us to be more like Him, knowing that we're not going to get there overnight, but God is sanctifying us step by step by step, by little by little by little. Faith works. Faith goes to work. It produces action. It's right there in the book of James. We do these actions not so that God will love us, but because God has loved us. I would challenge you to spend some time just in prayer this week, evaluating, okay, God, where have I deceived myself? Where do I need to spend some time and energy in doing the things that you have commanded us to do? I will pray for you this week as you take those steps.